Hello. Today, as you can see, I am joining you from my balcony because I think today is going to be one of the last nice days of the year, and I didn't want to waste it. Today, we're going to be talking about empirical claims and inductive reasoning. Now, there are different kinds of inductive reasoning, but the one that's mostly going to be relevant for our purposes is inductive generalizations, which has to do with drawing inferences about a whole group or class of things on the basis of looking at part of that group or some number of those things. I introduced you to the concept of an inductive generalization in a previous lecture. This discussion will be split into two videos. The first one talks about what empirical claims are and how to recognize them, and then launches into a discussion of sources of empirical evidence, where you can find sources and how to tell good sources from bad ones. In the discussion of sources, I had a couple of different goals in mind. Mostly I was thinking of the sort of sources that you might use in the essays that you write in university, including one of the essays that you need to write for this course, but also because this course is designed to help you with your other courses, that information should apply equally well to when you need to do research for essays in your other courses. But as always, I also had in the back of my mind navigating this crazy world that we live in and figuring out what it makes sense to believe. It's possible for some empirical research to provide evidence for a position, but not very strong evidence. If there's only one study on a particular topic and that study is not very large, well, a colleague of mine said something which I find very helpful in cases like this. He said that the only conclusion that you can legitimately infer from a single study is that more research is needed. Even if there are no flaws in the methodology of a study, that study can still turn out to be anomalous. In science, before results can be accepted as true, the results have to be replicated. This doesn't have anything to do with replicators or Earl Grey tea.
Tea, Earl Grey, hot.
It means that scientists should be able to repeat your research using the same or similar methods and come up with the same or similar results. A third thing that I had in mind in my discussion of sources was how to critically evaluate other people's use of sources, which could be when you're evaluating an argument or if you're asked to criticize a text. A critical essay is one of the two common kinds of essays that you're asked to do in university. Being able to evaluate their use of sources can help you in criticizing a text or rebutting an argument. The second video is going to be on inductive generalization and how to criticize statistical arguments. That is, arguments that use statistical premises. Arguments that cite research, in particular statistical research, in support of their claims or conclusions. I'm going to tell you about some problems you should look out for in arguments that cite statistics for their support. And some of those examples will come from YouTube videos where I found the example to be particularly illustrative or where I thought that the creator did a particularly good job of explaining what was going on. I feel like if I can find someone else who does at least as good a job as me of making the point that I wanted to make, why not let them tell you instead, just for variety? Also, YouTubers are professional entertainers who are going to frequently be more engaging and charismatic than me, at least in my opinion. Even I get tired of my voice from time to time. in one of our previous meetings, I introduced you to the 3 different types of claims. The main thing that differentiates them is how you would go about determining whether they're true or false, or correct or incorrect. The 3 types of claims are empirical or factual claims, which we're going to talk about today, moral, ethical, or value claims, and conceptual or meaning-based claims. I talked about conceptual or meaning-based claims in a previous class. I haven't talked about moral or value claims, but I will. And today, I'm going to talk about empirical or factual claims. So what is an empirical or factual claim? Now, I wrote this as empirical or factual because it's sort of like thesis and conclusion again. It's like, this is the technical term that experts and specialists use, and this is the everyday word. So I'm going to be treating these words as interchangeable, although technically the better term to use would be empirical. So empirical is a word that we use in philosophy, and empirical claim is a claim about how things really are in the world. Or a different way of thinking about it is, when you recognize an empirical claim because an empirical claim would be verified, where verified means finding out if it's true or not. An empirical claim is verified through some kind of observation. In other words, by going and looking, or some sort of equivalent of going and looking. The word factual claim is a little bit misleading because if you say this is a factual claim, you're kind of implying that it's true, but the way I'm using it here is means that it's a claim about facts, and by calling it a factual claim, I'm using that in the same way as I would use the word empirical, which means it's a claim about facts, not necessarily saying whether it's true or not. So, for something to be an empirical claim, it should be, in principle, verifiable by doing observation. That doesn't mean that it actually is verifiable at the moment, and it also doesn't mean that we have the answer to it. It doesn't even mean that it's true. Something is an empirical claim if it's making a claim about how things are in the world, even if it turns out to be false. Here are some examples. Global warming is not human cause. This is an empirical or factual claim because how would we know if it was true? Well, we would do observations. It's not true, but that doesn't mean that it's not an empirical claim. What makes it an empirical claim is that it's a claim about how things are in the world, and to verify it, we would do some sort of research. Next claim, there is life on other planets. Okay, this is an example of an empirical claim where we don't know what the answer is. There might be life on other planets. A lot of people are very excited about the possibility of life on other planets, and a lot of money is being spent trying to find out if there's life on other planets. That means that it's in principle verifiable, but it hasn't been verified yet. We're still working on it. Nevertheless, it's still an empirical claim because it's a claim about the way things actually are in the world. It's not a claim about what words mean. It's not a claim about the way things should be. It is a claim about the way things actually are. Next one. Our legal system contains racial bias. Okay, this is an example of a claim which you could treat, and in fact you should treat, as both an empirical claim and a conceptual claim. That's because the term, you would probably need to specify what you meant by racial bias before you could go about verifying it. You would need to do that because depending upon how the term racial bias is defined, different facts would verify it. You don't know which facts are going to verify it, or the opposite of verify, which I think is disconfirm. You don't know which facts are going to verify it or unverify it until you know what the word means. So it has a conceptual part because it has a word or a term in it that makes you want to go, well, that depends upon what you mean by racial bias. That's the conceptual part. But it's still a claim about how things are in the world, because look, it's a claim about our legal system. It's saying that something is true of our legal system. It's not saying our legal system is by definition biased. That would be a purely conceptual claim. It's not a claim that our legal system shouldn't be racially biased, which would be, I think that would be a value claim. It is a claim about how things are. This is the sort of claim that some people would say is a matter of opinion. I could assert that our legal system contains racial bias, and then somebody might say, well, that's just your opinion. There are at least two different ways of using the word opinion. I'm pretty sure I've said this before, but it bears repeating. There's at least two different ways of using the word opinion. There's the right way and the wrong way. The right way of using the word opinion is things that are strictly matters of opinion rather than matters of fact. So it's I'm eating blackberries. I like blackberries. Blackberries are delicious. That's an opinion. Blackberries are nutritious is not an opinion. It could be true or false. I haven't researched it. I assume that blackberries are nutritious, and I don't think I will research it because I just want to keep eating them. Anyway, but that's something that could be verified by making observations. Whether or not I like them, well, that's an opinion thing. It's like a subjective thing. So what I want is for you, in this course anyway, to use the word opinion to refer to things that are strictly matters of opinion, purely opinion, just opinion, not things that can be argued. Our legal system contains racial bias. You can construct an argument in support of that or an argument against it, which you can't really do for an opinion. I like the Marvel movies. I thought Iron Man 2 was pretty good, even though a lot of people didn't. That's an opinion. There's no argument there. This racial bias thing, however, you could give reasons for it, you could give reasons against it, and there's a good chance that one side might end up putting forth a stronger case than the other side. As a matter of fact, in political and media discourse, most things that are referred to as matters of opinion really ought to be treated as matters of fact. Our legal system does contain racial bias. If you were to go and look at the evidence, then you would draw the conclusion that unless you're defining racial bias in a really weird way, you would have to say that our legal system does contain racial bias. So when people refer to claims that can be argued for or possibly even proven or disproven as opinions, they're sort of being logically dishonest. When you say reasonable people can disagree, sure, reasonable people can disagree, but sometimes one of them is right and one of them is wrong. So I would prefer that you just use the word opinion for things that can't be argued and not use the word opinion for things where people just happen to disagree about it. Moving on. My cat's name is Fred. Okay, I use this example because the first two claims were scientific claims, and the next claim is, what is that? A social science claim? maybe a political claim, definitely a social science claim. But my cat's name is Fred is like that's a very specific claim, right? It's not a generalization. It's a claim about something that's true or not true in your life, which I want to throw in because I don't want to give you the impression that empirical claims have to be scientific or scientific-ish claims. They don't have to be big, important claims. They're simply claims that are verified or disconfirmed by making observations. So my cat's name is Fred. How would you determine whether or not that's true? Well, you'd ask the cat, obviously. Moving on. King Tut had a tummy ache on his 8th birthday. Okay, so this is an example of, no, let me back up. I can say that in a better way. So I said a empirical claim is a claim that in principle would be verified by observation, but it doesn't have to be something that we actually can verify. King Tut, you've probably heard of him. It doesn't matter if you haven't, just like a famous Egyptian pharaoh whose tomb was uncovered, I don't know, in the 60s or something, thousands of years old. So because he's thousands of years old, there's no way for us to know if he had a tummy ache on his 8th birthday. It's just we're never going to be able to answer that question. Nevertheless, it's still an empirical claim because it's the sort of claim that would be answered through observations if we could make those observations, which we can't. It doesn't depend upon, for example, what the word tummy ache means. The next one says, Hawaii was inducted into the United States by force. Okay, so this is a claim about history. And how would you go about verifying it? Well, I guess you would look at the historical records. It's a claim that you would determine whether it's true or false by doing research. It's about what actually happened. It's about the past, whether or not something happened. Whether or not something happened is an empirical claim because it's a claim about the way things are in the world. I guess I should say it's a claim about how things were in the world, but like close enough. Incidentally, I didn't put in an example of this, but I probably should have. Claims about the future normally are also empirical claims. So the claim, if we don't end global capitalism, then global warming will destroy our civilization. Well, that's a claim about the future. We don't know what the answer to that question is, but how would we go about getting the answer? Well, we wait and see. We wait until we can make the observations. The last one says, you are afraid of spiders. Okay, so this obviously depends upon whether or not this is true. It depends on who the you is, right? But this is a claim that you would only find in a context of like of a conversation where the who the you is unambiguous. So that's all by way of explaining how to recognize an empirical claim or factual claim, or what's not an empirical or factual claim. So the summary is it's a claim about the way things are in the world, or the way they were, or the way they're going to be in the world, which is verified in principle through observation. How do you deal with empirical claims? Well, the first thing that you need to do is you need to make sure that the claim is clear so that you can proceed to the next step, which is figuring out what observations you would need to make to determine whether or not it's true. So the racial bias one, you would have to figure out what's meant by racial bias before you could go and do the research. Oh, likewise, there is life on other planets? Well, you're sort of going to have to make a decision about what's going to count as life and what's not going to count as life before you make your observations, because otherwise you wouldn't know what are the right observations to make. It can be argued that viruses are alive. It can also be argued that viruses are not alive. So analogously, we might discover something on, like, say, in the ocean of Jupiter's moon Europa. Jupiter's moon Europa, by the way, is it's roughly the size of our moon, and it's completely covered in ice, water ice, and underneath that ice is a giant ocean that encapsulates the entire surface of the planet and is roughly 100 kilometers deep. So that is a lot of ocean. And it's also liquid water ocean. I think it's roughly the temperature of the colder parts of our ocean. So it's one of the places where scientists are very interested in looking for life. But we could send a probe to Europa and it could find something there, and it might not look like anything like that's alive here. Like, we can all agree that a bacterium or other single cell organism is alive, but what if it's a thing which isn't a cell or made of cells, and yet it has other features that we would want to say, like, makes it alive, like it's self-replicating and it feeds itself or something. This is a case of you're going to have to figure out what sort of observations you're going to need to verify your claim, which may involve deciding what it is exactly that you're looking for, what counts as life and what doesn't. Let's assume that your empirical claim is straightforward enough that you don't have to worry about what the words mean. You don't have to worry about the words being ambiguous. How do you go about verifying it? Well, philosophically speaking, you would verify it through observation. In practice, as a student, or as, let's say, a citizen deciding who to vote for in an election, you would probably find out by doing research, which means looking at sources of information, like books and web pages and so on. Most of the things that we know are not things that we've observed directly, but nevertheless, we're confident that they're true because they have been shown to be true by experts who agree, and we trust the experts. For example, subatomic particles, such as the electron, do not have a location in the same way that we normally understand locations. Like, my drinking bottle is here. Oh, look, it disappears. Okay, now you see it, now you don't. Maybe it is like an electron. Anyway, subatomic particles don't have a location in the same way that macroscopic things do. They sort of are like smeared over like a range of where they could be, depending on probability. But if you had a way of like detecting it, then suddenly it would act like it did have a location. And this doesn't really make very much sense, and I don't really understand it. And I certainly couldn't explain to you how we know that it's true, because before I could do that, I would probably have to go to school for 10 years. And I've already gone to school for about 300 years, so I don't want to do that. This is why we have experts. We have experts because sometimes it takes a lot of knowledge and a lot of time to be able to understand the evidence and piece it together. So that's why we trust experts. And when you like ask a politician if they think global warming is human caused, and they say, well, I'm not a scientist, they are doing a dodge. They're being dishonest and deceitful there, because, yeah, you're not a scientist. That's why we have scientists. So what do the scientists say? If the scientists say that global warming is human caused, then you should believe that it's human caused. And saying I'm not a scientist makes as much sense as saying, can airplanes fly? Well, I'm not a scientist. I don't understand the science behind aerodynamics. So the point is that when it comes to the sort of empirical claims that you would meet with in your courses and when you're writing your essays and when you're I don't know, evaluating the arguments that I ask you to evaluate in this course, you'll generally need to verify the empirical claims by doing research. There are straightforward everyday empirical claims like it's sunny outside today, and you don't do what you would call research for that, you just do what I just did. I turned my head and I looked out the window. But when it comes to writing papers and such, it comes down to doing research and looking at what people tell us. Now, the problem with doing research is that there's way too much information out there, and it's difficult to sift through, and we don't know what's true and what's not. Like, you can type any question you want into a web browser, and you might get a bunch of answers, but how do you know if the answers are true? Well, it comes down to whether or not they come from a reliable source, or as we like to say in academia, an authoritative source. Basically, experts. So here are some examples of authoritative sources. Scholarly books and articles. I'll talk about them some more in a minute. Reputable newspapers. Newspapers are good places to look for straightforward factual claims. Like, when it comes down to it, the job of a newspaper is to report the news, which basically means stuff that happened. So newspapers should be reliable when it comes to determining whether or not something happened, like what share of the vote that Biden got in the recent US election. A newspaper should be a reliable source for that. But I had to say reputable newspapers because in the age of the internet, newspapers, for the most part, aren't newspapers anymore, right? The print medium is no longer financially viable for newspapers for the most part. But that means that, well, anybody can make a web page and make it look authoritative. So there is a lot of disinformation out there. And like I talked about in our previous class, there's a lot of so-called newspapers and other news sources who actually exist for the purpose of disinformation. They are there in order to lie to you. So you need to know the difference between reputable and disreputable newspapers. How do you know? I'll get back to you. Government statistics and archives. I don't really know how much to explain about this. They're good sources for statistics, for specifically statistical information. You know, not particularly a good source for scientific information and such, but governments do lots of statistics and they keep information in archives, and some of that information is available on the internet for you to look up. Reputable polling organizations. Okay, in case it's not clear what's meant by the word poll, well, I think I talked about that when I talked about statistics. You know, so a poll is like, what do Canadians think about whether cannabis should have been legalized? You would like a poll to determine what people think. That's what polls normally are. How do you tell the difference between reputable and non-reputable? Well, let's get into that. Or instead, we could talk about scholarly books and articles. Okay, well, what does this mean? All right. Scholarly basically means it's from the experts. So I'm a philosophy professor, so I'm an expert in philosophy, but not really. I'm an expert in certain areas of philosophy. Likewise, there aren't really people who are experts in physics. They're experts in particular areas of physics. But my point is that scholarly means from the experts. How do you recognize them? Okay, well, a scholarly journal is like pretty easy to recognize. It doesn't really look like anything else. It's going to have scholarly articles in it, which generally mean things that nobody wants to read, and they're going to have abstracts and so on. And one really good way of determining whether or not an article is a scholarly article or whether a journal is a scholarly journal has to do with how you access that information. So, for instance, if you use York Library has got a number of like search engines for finding scholarly books and articles. Well, hey, if you use those, then you can be pretty comfortable that what you're going to get is going to qualify as scholarly. There are some online versions, but the disadvantage of using those is most journals, you have to pay to read them. And so you could find it online, but you wouldn't be able to read it. York has lots and lots of money and consequently has subscriptions to lots and lots of journals. So if you use York's online resources, that means that you actually get access to the things using your student ID and login information. That's where your money is going. Books by university presses or scholarly imprints. How do you know if a book is by a university press or scholarly imprint? Well, like you just like look in the book and it'll tell you who the publisher is. What is a scholarly imprint? Okay, so when it comes to these kind of books, they're either going to be published by universities or they're going to be published by regular book publishers. Some regular book publishers, most of the really big ones, have scholarly imprints, which basically means they might publish like science fiction books and cookbooks or whatever, but those will be like under a different name than from scholarly books. So why am I talking about these things? Because you're supposed to treat scholarly sources as authoritative. So for instance, if you are reading a text that's making an argument and the text makes some sort of empirical claim and it gives you a citation, and the citation takes you to a scholarly journal article, then you can probably go, oh, okay, well then that I should probably trust that. That's fine. If it takes you to like a random web page, then you probably shouldn't trust it. So that is the point of this discussion. Likewise, when you write your own papers, I want your sources to be authoritative sources, such as scholarly books and articles, and not random web pages. Reputable newspapers. Okay, how do you know if a newspaper is reputable? Well, there are like a bunch that we just know are reputable. Generally, they're the ones that have been around for a long, long time. The ones that actually were newspapers before an internet. So like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and like some of the others here. Although some of these, I think Politico does not predate the internet. I think that only ever had an internet-based existence. If you're not sure, if it isn't a name that you recognize, if it isn't a part of this list, sometimes you can Google it and just see what you get. For instance, when we've been going through some of the examples in class, I've just like gone to Wikipedia and like I don't want you to use Wikipedia as if it were a scholarly source, but you can use Wikipedia to decide whether or not something is a reputable newspaper. If it's something you've never heard of, well, then you're going to have to do some work to determine whether or not it's something that you can trust. You know that there's something called Conservapedia, I think? It's like a Wikipedia for the alternate universe that conservatives live in. And the whole reason why it exists is because it's like an alternative to Wikipedia, and the mere fact that they're constructing a conservative alternative is already a pretty strong hint that it's not going to be a reliable source. I bring it up only because I think it's funny. Government statistics and archives. I already talked about that. This is just some links. Reputable polling organizations. How do you know if a polling organization is reputable? Well, basically the same thing as like for newspapers, the ones that have been around for a long time, and you can look them up. Note, universities do polls. If the university does a poll, well, then you should probably treat it as reputable. Here are some non-reputable sources. Think tanks. I talked about think tanks before. So think tanks are basically sources of disinformation. So if you're, here's a good way about thinking about think tanks and distinguishing them from proper research institutions like universities. If you're going to go about things in an honest and scientific way, what you do is like you have like a question and you try to, and then you do research to find out if that question is true, or you have a hypothesis and then you do research to determine if the hypothesis is true. And in science, the way science is normally practiced is that you actually try to disprove your hypothesis. You have your hypothesis and you go and you try to find the evidence that if you got this evidence that would show that your hypothesis is false. That's how science works. Think tanks are the opposite. They will have a position, they will have like a claim, which is normally going to be something related to politics, and then they'll like try to prove that it's true, which I'm sure you can see is pretty dishonest, and it is why you shouldn't treat them as authoritative sources. One good way of recognizing think tanks and other non-authoritative sources is to look at the names. Like, let me see. Heritage Foundation doesn't really tell you anything. What about the Center for American Progress? Well, that sounds like a good thing, right? Like we all like progress. So the name itself is already telling you that there's some sort of bias here. So that is one way that you can recognize politically biased think tanks, but just don't rely on think tanks at all. Like rely upon universities and newspapers and sources that we know are authoritative. Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a special case. I think it's somewhere in my contract as a professor that I'm supposed to tell you not to use Wikipedia as a source for research, which is a little bit dishonest because I use it all the time. So there's a correct way and an incorrect way to use Wikipedia. The thing about Wikipedia is that the Wikipedia articles are supposed to cite sources. So if you want an answer to a question, you can go to Wikipedia and then look at the sources that they use and then go and see what the sources say. Well, go and decide whether or not the sources are authoritative and then see what they say. So Wikipedia is a good place for you to start your research, just so long as you don't finish your research there. I hope that makes sense. Random web page. I don't know why I should say this, but if I don't tell my students that they can't just treat any random web page as if it were an authoritative source, if I don't tell them that, then a whole bunch of people will do it. In the past, I've gotten like arguments, and in order to support their claims, you know, they'll just like Google something, and as soon as they find something that seems to support it, they'll use that as their citation without trying to figure out if it's a real authoritative source or, you know, just somebody in their basement. So how do you tell when a source is trustworthy or not? Well, ideally, it's just going to be something that you recognize, like a university or the New York Times or something. But what if it's something that you don't recognize? So how would you go about judging? There's a couple of methods that you can use, and none of them are 100% reliable, but they can sometimes give you a pretty good idea. If a text does not have an author, that ought to be a red flag. It's a red flag because you can't tell whether or not the author is somebody that you should rely upon. You can't tell whether or not they're an expert or what field they're an expert in because you don't know who they are. So if there isn't an author, that's like a red flag that maybe this isn't an authoritative source. That said, there are exceptions because sources of statistics, I don't usually put in authors. Do they cite their sources? You know, well, that sort of gets back to what I said about Wikipedia. If you have, like, if you can find an article, you know, and it looks like it's authoritative and it's written in, let me talk about it this way. You've probably noticed that it's really easy to recognize phishing emails, you know, phishing with the PH, where they're trying to get your credit card or bank information or something like that, you know, so they're trying to trick you into giving them access to your finances or something, they're really easy to recognize because they're almost always written really poorly. There'll be like obvious grammatical and spelling mistakes. I assume because they're largely written by people for whom English is not their first language. So if something's badly written, then it's probably not an authoritative source. That isn't to say that somebody can't be smart and still not write very well. Of course, you can be very smart and still not write very well. You could be an expert and still not be a very good writer, but like a reputable publisher isn't going to publish something if it's like full of like spelling and grammar mistakes. So if it's poorly written, then that is another red flag that you probably shouldn't trust it. Now, standards and conventions of scholarly writing extend beyond things like grammar. Another expectation of scholarly writing is tone. Like scholarly writing is supposed to sound objective. It's not supposed to sound opinionated. If it comes across as opinionated, then that is a red flag that it's probably not a source that you can rely upon. And here's a tip for writing your essays. You don't want to sound opinionated or emotional in your essays. You don't want to exaggerate. If you do, you kind of undermine your credibility. You basically make yourself sound, well, biased, I guess. So when you're writing essays for university, try and keep the tone like calm. Don't use exaggeration. Don't use a lot of rhetorical flourishes. I recently had to tell this to, it was a note. I have a lot of grading to do this week. And one of the papers was like a pretty good paper, except it was written very, very forcefully. It was like, it didn't sound like it was objective. It sounded like the person was emotional and had a real agenda to push, which does not meet the standards of scholarly writing. You should sound objective. Beware of propaganda sounding language. Well, okay, I basically, like I already alluded to that, like in the titles of institutions and things, but you can also find propaganda sounding language in the texts of sources. So propaganda sounding language would be, I can give you an example, the Tucker Carlson one. Good old fucker Carlson. Democrats defend their liberal immigration policy by claiming that diversity is our strength. Okay, well, that's fine. But if you look here, these are important questions when our leaders are radically and permanently changing our country wholly on the basis that diversity is our strength. Can you tell that that is not written in a particularly calm or level sounding tone? That's what I mean by propaganda sounding language. Radically and permanently changing, that's scary sounding language. Somebody is trying to scare you, you probably shouldn't trust them. If there's like emotional language and it sounds like they're trying to play on your feelings, then that's a red flag that you probably shouldn't trust the source. So here's an example. A couple of years ago, there was like a lot of discussion on forums and discussion boards and whatever. So the topic, whether or not we should allow students to use laptops in class, came up. And there are people who are very opinionated about this. One of these opinionated people cited some research that said that not only are devices distracting to the students using the devices, but they're distracting to the other students around them. If there was if there was somebody next to you who was using a device, then it like negatively impacted your test scores and whatever. You know, somebody beside you or somebody in front of you. Somebody concluded that there's actually a measurable and surprisingly large impact of like secondhand distraction, I suppose you could call it. And I found that kind of implausible, so I looked into it. Here's an article, Technology and Student Distraction. You can read this later. If you want, it's an interesting read. Is it an authoritative source? Well, I'm not going to tell you because I don't care. I'm just using it as an example to illustrate a particular point. Let's look at this paragraph here, okay? The case against technology in the classroom. If you've been anywhere near a college campus, you've probably noticed the extent. Have you ever been anywhere near a college campus? If you've been anywhere near a college campus, you've probably noticed the extent to which students are glued to their mobile devices. What do they do with them when they walk into the classroom? In one survey at 6 different universities, college students reported using their phones an average of 11 times per day in class. In another study, 92% of college students reported using their phones to send text messages during class. And you will note that these things are hyperlinked, which I guess is the online version of inserting a footnote. So you click it and it takes you to the source. Here we go. Here's your source. Is this a reputable source? Probably. University of Nebraska. This is what I want to draw your attention to. What is worse is that mobile device usage is distracting to neighboring students. See, that's what I wanted to talk about, distracting to other students. In several surveys, students have reported that texting is distracting to nearby students. So let's click on this one. What is its source here? The use and abuse of cell phones and text messaging in the classroom, a survey of college students. Okay, well, I looked through this, like I read the abstract and whatever, and like this is fine. This is a totally acceptable piece of research. Like this article here is an authoritative source. And remember, this is a discussion about how it's always better to look at the original source rather than just trusting the text that cites the source. Okay, it's always better to go and look at the original source rather than trust the text that's citing the source. Now, does that mean that you have to read every journal article that gets cited in every assignment that I give you where you're supposed to evaluate an argument? Well, no, you could just read the abstract. I don't think that's asking you too much to read the abstract here. And that will probably give you enough information to answer the question. That question being, does the source that's cited actually say what the person citing it says it does? Because sometimes it doesn't. I wish this was an example of that, but it's not. It's an example of something else. The problem here is that the author says in several surveys, and then it gives you a link to one survey. So yeah, okay, you know, one survey is better than no surveys, but it is a bit misleading for you to say in several surveys and then give us only one, because it's possible that only one exists, but they say in several surveys in order to make the case sound stronger than it is. And that's important, which brings us to the next sentence. A study on laptops in a simulated classroom found that students in the vicinity of another student who was multitasking on a laptop during class scored worse on a test than those who were not near multitaskers. This is the study that I alluded to a moment ago when I was talking about the colleague who was making the argument that we should ban laptops in the classroom. Let's click on this study, shall we? Laptop multitasking hinders classroom learning for both users and nearby peers. So like I said, I found the claim implausible, so I went and I looked it up. Now, you don't have to read the whole thing to get the point that I want you to get. I'm looking for the methodology. It was like a survey of less than 100 students in one class in 1 year at one university, which is a pretty small pool, and it isn't something that you can draw a general conclusion from, right? It wasn't a large number of students. It was just in one class, in 1 year, at one university. It's just not enough research to draw a general conclusion, especially if that conclusion is like controversial or implausible sounding. So what my colleague was doing was, you know, basically they obviously had already made up their mind about laptops in the classroom, and then they found some research that basically backed up what they wanted to say, and they weren't too critical about it. The way scientific research works is that it's supposed to be replicatable.
Tea, Earl Grey, hot.
Anyway, the idea is other researchers should be able to do the same kind of research that you did, and they should come up with the same results. So there, like a colleague of mine said something that I'll always remember, like the conclusion that is warranted by any one study, the only conclusion that's warranted is more research is needed, because one study can easily yield anomalous results. And I don't know if there's been more research on this topic since, but at the time, I could only find, like, it was just the one survey that said that devices distracted students around you in a way that affected their test scores. And the person who was citing it sort of conflated that research with other research that said that if you use a laptop yourself, then it's going to be distracting and affect your test scores. That's not at all hard to believe. She made it sound like there was lots of research on the second topic when actually there was just one. So when you go, another reason to go and look at the original source is just to see, like, how seriously should you take this? If it was like one study and it was a small study and it was done at one university and whatever, then it's fairly weak evidence. And if you can't find a second source, like a second study, not just something that cites the same source, you might not want to accept that as evidence in an argument.